Welcome to Close Up with the Hollywood Reporter documentary. I'd like to welcome Chai Vasarhelyi, Rashida Jones, Bing Liu, Morgan Neville, Julie Cohen, and Tim Wardle. So let's get started. What is happening with documentaries this year? Morgan, you had a big box office hit with Won't You Be My Neighbor. RBG, Three Identical Strangers. Quincy has just come onto Netflix. Free Solo. Why is the audience responding the way they are?
It's funny, this is my 25th year of making documentaries, and when I started making documentaries, there was nothing cool about documentaries. I mean, the only reason to make them was because you love them. Yeah. And I remember 5 years ago doing this roundtable, and there was debate at the table of people wanting to get rid of the word documentary because it wasn't cool enough. Right. I mean, what a difference 5 years makes. I mean, it's amazing to be in the moment we're having with documentary now. And I think part of it is we're making films that other people aren't making, kind of adult films that are asking real questions, that are engaging with the real world. And it's just scratching something that I think an audience is dying for in this day and age.
In the case of your film about Fred Rogers, Mr. Rogers, I mean, some commentators chalked it up to nostalgia. Do you think it was more than that?
No, I mean, I hate nostalgia. You know, it's the fast food of emotions. I mean, nostalgia literally means going home. I mean, it's inherently a regressive idea that doesn't ask much from an audience. And I felt like this film was inherently a progressive idea. Not how do we go back, but how do I get Fred Rogers into 2018? Mm-hmm. Who's a better advocate for these kinds of crucial issues we have in our culture right now about civility and neighborliness and kindness? And, you know, there's no kindness lobby in Hollywood. Mm-hmm. And anywhere in America these days. Fred Rogers was kind of the closest thing I could come up with, and it was just trying to amplify that message.
I mean, you were born a couple of years before the show started. Did you grow up watching him?
I was born 6 months before the show started, and I was like Gen 1 Mr. Rogers fanatic. You know, it was before Sesame Street. And my relationship with him predates my memory, you know, and it also, probably outside of my immediate family, was the first adult relationship I really had with somebody. So I don't even remember all of those things, but in making the film, it took me back to revisit part of myself that I hadn't thought about in a really, really long time. Making the film was like 10 years worth of therapy rolled into one production. You know, it was very cost efficient in that way. And I honestly had no idea if anybody else cared. I mean, I had a number of people tell me when I was making the film, they're like, Mr. Rogers, really? You know, right. Good luck with that, you know? And it turns out a lot of people were touched in a similar way.
Low production values, simple set, unlikely star. Yet, it worked. Because he was saying something really important.
Love is at the root of everything. All learning, all parenting, all relationships, love or the lack of it.
I mean, I'm interested in hearing how you all settled on your subjects. I mean, Rashida, you have an even more intimate connection to your subject because the film is about your father, Quincy Jones. Growing up, did you have a feeling you were sharing him with the world, and did that play into the decision to make this film?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Me and all of my siblings and anybody who's ever loved him shares him with the world, and that's part of loving him. The reason I wanted to make this is because he is well documented. There's actually really kind of extensive pieces on him, but he's so accomplished that you never get to actually spend time with him in any of those pieces because you have to cover the decades of success that he's had. There is something inherently personal about it. So who he is in his private life and who he is when he connects with people is precisely the thing that, you know, kind of incites his success. Also hard work and talent, but it is one of the many things.
Ego is usually just an overdressed insecurity. I think you have to dream so big that you can get an ego.
I mean, did he need any encouragement to open himself and the rest of your family up to the cameras?
He was very, very generous. Many times we would think we were done filming for the day and he'd be like, aren't you coming in to the hotel? It's like 3 in the morning, 4 in the morning. He was very generous, and he also said, I don't want to see anything until you're done, which to me, I mean, the complications with knowing your subject is that they're going to have some sort of like micromanaging control over the story you tell, and he did not do that at all, and that's probably the only reason I did it.
I'm amazed at how much your various subjects allow themselves to be exposed. I mean, Julie, you must have had a complicated situation because your film is about a sitting Supreme Court justice, and the justices don't usually allow this sort of coverage. How did you convince Ruth Ginsburg?
Yeah, absolutely. And I can assure you that we did not have Rashida's experience of when we were done filming Justice. Now, come on, come back for a little more. I had interviewed Justice Ginsburg in the past. My directing partner had interviewed her as well. We approached her a long time ago, actually in early 2015, and said, hey, we've got this great idea. We're going to make a film about your life. Like, what do you think? And she said, not yet. So we kind of went back to her with different approaches and basically got her to allow us to start doing interviews with other people that weren't her. People were sort of reporting back to her that we were taking the whole thing seriously, that we weren't just like, we didn't want to just do a whole film about RBG tattoos that people have, even though that is amusing and is part of our film, but like that we really wanted to take a pretty deep look into her career, into some of the pretty intense sexism and discrimination she had faced and how she forged through it and how that connected with what she'd done, and kind of looking at constitutional law, another subject that people are like, oh yeah, it's a theatrical doc about constitutional law, like you're gonna really get butts and seats with that.
How did you respond?
Well, never in anger, as my mother told me. That would have been self-defeating. Always as an opportunity to teach. I did see myself as kind of a kindergarten teacher in those days because the judges didn't think sex discrimination existed. Well, one of the things I tried to plant in their minds was think about how you would like the world to be for your daughters and granddaughters.
She actually never said yes. It was just like we were sort of making the film, and ultimately she started to participate in it. At one point, several months into filming, her assistant actually sent us a list saying, like, here's 12 things the justice is going to be doing over the next year that she thought might make interesting filming opportunities. So we were like, wow, even though at that point she hadn't even committed to an interview or...
Did she suggest you follow her to the gym, or did you propose that?
No. And we had that in mind from like very early on. We were like, oh yeah, and like the dream is we'd go in the gym and have her working out, but like thinking, like, is that ever gonna happen? Like, no. We didn't even approach that with her until really, really near the end. She sort of had gotten used to our presence, and we were like, do you think we might be able to maybe go in and see your workout? And she just paused, as she always does, because she pauses. That's one of her signature conversational maneuvers, is a long pause. And then she just said, yes, I think that might be possible.
Very good. I mean, Tammy, your movie is about three brothers who learn that they're related as young men. And they had been through a lot of media attention and kind of got burnt by it. I mean, when you showed up, did they take convincing to sit for a film?
I got engaged, married, and had a child in the space of time it took us to convince them to take part in the film. So it was pretty hard going because of the trauma that had been inflicted on them and the kind of sense that they'd been let down by so many people in the past. How does that process work? Here's this British guy who kind of shows up in New York and says, I want to talk about some painful things that happened to you in the past. Look, I think it helped actually being British, and sometimes being an outsider can be really useful. Their interest is kind of piqued, they're kind of intrigued. But really it's just a process of earning trust. I mean, you can't do anything without trust, and spend a lot of time without cameras, just going to meet them, meet their families, meet their friends, explain the kind of film we wanted to make. But I mean, to be honest, even when we were filming, there were days when I thought, are they going to show up? And for the master interviews, I mean, we really didn't know if they were going to turn up or not. So we were kind of living on that knife edge the whole way through.
The lights were on in the house. And I reached out to knock on the door. And as I reached out to knock on the door, it opens. And there I am. His eyes are my eyes, and my eyes are his eyes, and it's true.
Bing, did you have something similar? Because you have this film that explores the lives of these young men that come from the community you came with, and they're very exposed in the movie. How did you convince them to take part in it?
It was like a 4-year conversation. At times, I think it felt like this meta conversation on camera, where it's like, you know, I just filmed you abandoning your apartment. How do you feel about being in the film now? You know, we've already talked about, you know, you seeing the film before we release it. And, you know, they would give their thoughts, but most of the time they felt so included, you know, in the process that I think they felt comfortable. And then when we finally sat them down to show them the finished film, none of them wanted anything changed.
Like sometimes I know that I have to work with him, so I sneak out my window, like throw my boy out first and just climb out.
And then when I got home, I got disciplined. And I wasn't able to skate for a while.
How did you get disciplined?
I mean, well, they call it child abuse now, but it's not really child.
And Chai, in your case, I assume you kind of knew the climber. Tell us about how you knew this was the right time to do a film about him.
Jimmy, who's my directing partner, had known Alex for 10 years. So they had been on a lot of expeditions together and knew each other quite well. So when the idea came up, we were talking about it, and at that point, we were just interested in a character portrait about Alex. And he brought up El Cap. I was the first person he told about this, and when I told Jimmy, he's like, no way.
Which is the mountain
That,
in Yosemite.
that he wants to free solo El Capitan in Yosemite, right, which is 3,000 feet, and there's no one, it had never even been talked about as an idea. We thought it was too risky. We had to really sit with that debate if this was something we were comfortable with, and talk to Alex and like kind of spend time together. But it does always come down to trust. We had to trust Alex in a very, very profound way that he would make the right decisions. You know, the film is very intimate. Like Alex is a very candid person. This is who he is. I don't know how much he understood we were gonna move in with him. You know, like we were living in that van. He was essentially cooking me dinner many, many nights. He would give me my own little bowl. Then he began to trust us. So it was this, especially with this type of film with the risks involved, like the trust was profound. And, you know, he never asked to see the film. He didn't want to. And at the very end, I was like, you really have to see the film before we show it to people. And he loved the climbing, and the rest of it is very painful for him. But that's okay.
Our next guest is a free soloing phenomenon. Please welcome Alex Cohen. Here is what I don't understand. One little mistake, one little slip, and you fall and die.
Yeah, I mean, you seem to understand it well.
Yes.
Yeah. I feel like anybody could conceivably die on any given day. Soloing makes it feel far more immediate and much more present.
There's a kind of continuum in documentary making where on one hand you have Frederick Weissman who just records, doesn't offer narration, any guidance to the viewer. And on the other hand, you have Michael Moore and Morgan Spurlock who are the center of their films and everything is funneled through them. How do each of you decide what role you'll play, either as a character in the film or as a narrator? You kind of introduce yourself at the beginning of the film, Rashida, but then you kind of stay out of frame a lot of the time.
Yeah, that was by design. Originally, I thought about a film about a father and daughter, but then his life is too big and there's too much to cover, and I also didn't want to be a subject in the film, so I thought maybe the best compromise, my directing partner, Al Hicks, and I decided together that to have me sort of introduce the audience into the world, so they feel like they can use me as a lens if they need to, but then to hopefully get a little bit lost in his perspective and, you know, the largeness of his life and his accomplishments. But I think it's a very tricky thing to do that well, to be a subject in your film, and it's hard to be critical on yourself. I tend to overcorrect and just like not want me on film as much as possible.
And being it seems to me your film was something similar, we hear you often, but even some crucial moments, it seems that you don't want to take center stage in the film.
Yeah, it wasn't intended at the beginning. Those moments where you hear me or you feel me off frame or the camera sort of is the character. I mean, that happens pretty much in every documentary. It's just happened to become useful in hindsight later when I did decide to be in the film. I think there was one moment that was a catalyst for making that decision. It was when one of the characters revealed to me this abuse that was happening in a relationship, and I had to have a long sort of conversation with myself and my team about what gives me the right to go ahead and, you know, keep telling this story. And ultimately, I chose to go back into my own backstory to do that.
Wow, so you weren't going to be a character in the film as you initially conceived it, but you're like one of the greatest characters.
I sort of wanted to go for this, more Weissman-esque end of the scale, where it's like, I want to make this, observational film. It's going to be just their lives, it's verite, and then of course this moment happens, and it's like, it's like what happens in a lot of documentaries. Something happens, you sort of have to, reconfigure the whole story.
I feel that's what works really well in your film and Rashida's film, that you sense that this isn't an ego trip, that you don't want to put yourself there. You've kind of come to this position as like the last kind of option almost. You've organically become part of it. Sometimes you watch films and, the director's really in there, and having been through documentary edits, you could have cut yourself out there. You could have, but with your films, you couldn't, and you were in it the minimum you could be for it to be for them to be the great films they are.
We really struggled with this, like on Free Solo, where, and it's kind of the virtue of the directing partnership, where I can kind of torture my directing partner, who's also my husband, because he has to be in the film. But we were very reluctant to always do this, but then it became very clear that the ethical question that's like the existential center of this film had to be grappled with in the film itself. And the only way to do that was by revealing how we were doing this and the discussions that were happening around this. And also, just from a storytelling point of view, like that, Alex was alone, and you need someone to respond to him, to help an audience.
Totally, and that cameraman you have respond is just the most extraordinary. I mean, it sort of makes, that last sequence is extraordinary anyway, but having the camera person like freaking out is like, and you get that he's like a hardened professional, and he's still having that reaction.
Oh no, yes, and he has that reaction because he knew the route the best, so he knows exactly where the difficult parts are. But Jimmy never wanted to be part of the movie, but you forced him. That's the wonderful thing about this directing partnership. I was like, it's really, really important, and you do it, but it's like how to do it, the moderation, the degree, without taking away from your subject itself.
But I think those ethical questions are really interesting that you see at the forefront of your film, and in Bing's, when you have the footage and you have like, am I going to confront, characters about things that other people have told me and whether I should do that? And we had that to a kind of degree as well. When you're learning things about these guys in my films, their past, the mental health issues in their past, and genetic backstories that their families have. It's like, how far should I take this? Where does my duty as a filmmaker end and my duty of care to the contributors begin? And where's the line? It's always shifting. It's a judgment thing.
I wondered that too, because I definitely struggled with that, because I have my dad in the hospital. I mean, he almost died, and Al and I talked a lot about not putting that footage in the movie, because I'm protective ethically and also of a family member, but mainly because of the ethics of it. But there's no story to tell without that, I felt. But I thought that a lot about your mom, because when she says to you, I want to do whatever I can do to help you heal. If it's shooting this movie, then so be it. Was that sort of part of the impetus for making the movie, was to heal yourself, even when you didn't think you were going to be a subject?
Yeah, I mean, I think it might have been on the same parallel of trying to heal myself. It was sort of looking for an answer to, can I escape the cycle that I just was noticing more and more going into my 20s? And so I started out by just going around and asking people from all over the country, young skateboarders, that question. And patterns started emerging, and I was like, okay, I don't know if I'm going to heal from this. I don't know if I'm going to get the answers I'm looking for, but it's helping. So I'm going to keep going with it. So.
What are the issues in making a film about a living subject? I imagine that just becomes much trickier, although, in the case of Mr. Rogers, who's no longer with us, you also have to make decisions about how much to show and what vulnerabilities to show.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Mrs. Rogers, Joanne, who's an amazing woman, when I explained to her the film I wanted to make, I said, I want to make a film about his ideas, not about his biography. And she said, well, that sounds like a good thing, because Fred always said if anybody made a film out of his life, it'd be the most boring film ever. I said, well, I don't necessarily agree with that. But when she gave me her blessing, she said, don't make him into a saint. And I can't think of anything a filmmaker wants to hear more from The Guardian. And I think part of that is to understand that he was human, and to treat him as saintly means that you don't appreciate the hard work he had to do to actually do these things. With that blessing, it was this chance to really get into the human struggle that he dealt with. Because we make films often about other people and other stories, that people don't think they're about us as filmmakers. I think this is all part of this discussion of kind of acknowledging our roles as filmmakers in the tellings of these stories and the editorial decisions that are made. And for years, when I would make films with a subject, I would say to them, this is going to be like therapy for you. Of course, each film is therapy for us, too. You know, we're all investigating part of our own lives in making these films. And I think just coming to terms with that, which is happening more and more, is both honest and just and healing, I guess, in a way.
Do you think, though, Morgan, that there's this kind of interesting paradox that I often struggle with as a documentary maker, that very few documentary filmmakers I know would allow themselves to be the subject of someone else's documentary, and yet we spend our entire lives trying to convince people to be in our films. And it's just an interesting thing that I kind of wrestle with all the time. Particularly when I'm in production, I'm always thinking, wow, if this was me and someone else, you know, the amount of power you have as a filmmaker. You know, in a way, because my film, you use the term subjects, which you guys use in the States. In the UK, we tend to more say kind of contributor, but because the subjects of my film, the contributors of my film, were actual subjects of a science experiment, I started seeing the parallels and the power imbalance between scientist and subject in medical research and subjects in documentary, and it's just an interesting thing that you can never quite resolve, or I can never quite resolve it, but it's like there all the time in the back of my head.
It is. I don't think any of us underestimates the power we have over our subjects, and so, you know, I think that's part of us taking responsibility for that and just being honest about that. I mean, I think ultimately those people who trust us, and we've all had these years of conversations with people, and trust is coin of the realm in documentary, they understand ideally that what we're doing is for them as much as it is for us. You know, that in telling their story and having them trust us with their story, even if it can be painful, it's in service of a greater healing or a greater purpose. And I think all of us have had that experience universally. I'm sure you had it with the brothers, you know, and seeing what has happened with my film and with many of these films about how your subjects react to them after they come out, even if it can be painful, I think in the long run, it's virtually always for the best.
What is the moment like when you complete a film and you decide to show it to your subject or your contributor? Do you do anything to prepare them, or do you sit nervously to the side of the room?
Well,
what was that
hopefully
like?
you've prepared them for the years that you've been filming, right? That's what it's about. And I feel like in terms of your question about the ethics of it is that Free Solo is a very extreme example of this. People say, what happens if you caused him to die? There's no get out of jail free card for this. Like, nonfiction is unexpected. You do not know what's going to happen next, but clearly we trusted him to make the right decisions and trusted ourselves to do a good job. But I feel like the answer lies in the treatment of the subject matter, right? Like if Alex died, we would have had the horrible task of making a film with that fact.
Do you think there would still have been a film?
I think you would have to, because that's the point, is that he trusted us to make a film. Clearly, we'd never have done it if we thought Alex was going to die. Like, Jimmy has had 20 years of experience in this area. This is what they do. They're professional climbers. But it always made me think that they are trusting us, that our treatment of the subject is one of dignity or of respect. And it can really go all over the place with documentaries. You see different films treat their subjects differently, and it comes down to the opinion and the gaze of the filmmaker.
In the case of like Quincy Jones and Ruth Bader Ginsburg, they're public people, so they're used to scrutiny, and I suppose Alex has some celebrity, but when you're dealing with kind of just regular folk, they're not necessarily sophisticated about all of this.
Well, I think my guys were pretty sophisticated because they'd been through that kind of media scrum before, but I think a lot of time had passed. I think my experience showing them the film, and it is always, I mean, I've only ever made films with kind of regular people. I've never filmed celebrities or famous people or anything like that. It is very nerve-wracking showing them the film. The experience I had with the brothers when they watched it, they both liked it. I showed them separately, and that was lovely. But the reaction I got, they both kind of got up and hugged me afterwards, and it wasn't about liking the film. It was like, you did what you said you were going to do. And I realised at that moment, I hadn't realised it making it. They'd been let down so many times by so many people that just the act of literally following through on what I said I was going to do was a huge moment for them. And I never expected that to be the big emotional release from them.
I think as documentary makers, we have a big advantage over a lot of journalists and broadcast people in particular, because like we kind of keep coming back, and people like your triplets had been the victims of a lot of like hit and run type journalism in the past, people wanting a really simple, really packaged little story. They come in, they sometimes misrepresent. Like, the good thing about, we're often following people around for months or years at a time, and they feel that you're trying to do something a little bit fuller, and you're really trying to show their truth or their life through your eyes. Obviously, showing Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the film that we had made about her life, was incredibly nerve-wracking. Her first time seeing it was at the world premiere at Sundance. We very much did not want to show it to her in advance because we sort of didn't want the public information apparatus of the court involved in trying to make any changes, and actually she never asked to see it. She just said, sure, I'll fly out to Park City and see the film, which was great, but set us up for like the most nerve-wracking 97 minutes of our lives. Betsy, my directing partner, and I were like, 4 feet away from her during the screening. We were just like staring at her through the entire film, and we could hear her comments because we were really close. So one day,
she's a talker at the movies.
She talked and she whispered. Classical music starts at the top. She's like, "Ooh, I like the music," and then like it goes on. She's laughing. She laughed at her own humor as well as some others. And at one point, Nina Totenberg, who's also in the film, was sitting next to her, and she leaned over and asked for a tissue. And Betsy starts hitting me. She's asking for a tissue. She's asking for a tissue. So it turned out to be like kind of like the greatest payoff of all time to have this kind of incredible, iconic lady like watching our film about her and really, really like grooving on it was pretty fun.
Rashida, did you show parts of the film to your father?
No, we didn't show him until we were pretty much locked, which was also very nerve-wracking because I have to. You could never talk to Justice Ginsburg ever again. I have to deal with that. But he loved it, he laughed, he cried. And it's funny because, people watch the movie and they say to me, I feel so lazy. I feel like I've done nothing in my life because he's obviously accomplished so much. And the first thing he said was, I wish I could live forever, which is, sums the whole thing up. There was like one shot he didn't like. He didn't like his pants or something. And that was it. He was totally fine.
With the pimp shoes.
Yeah, the pimp shoes. He liked the pimp shoes.
Being the two other young men in your film, they had obviously never seen themselves on film before, I would imagine.
But they've been around cameras. They grew up, skateboarding is part and parcel of, what it means to be a skateboarder is you're being filmed, skate videos are the throbbing heart of the skateboarding culture. And so they grew up with it, but at the same time, they saw themselves in moments of celebration all throughout their childhoods because these edits came out. And so they weren't prepared, I think, for what was going to be in the film. But at the same time, they were there when we filmed, all those dark moments. Ultimately, I think it mattered more to them that they had a voice, that they had, it felt like their lives are validated. And I think they were surprised that I was in the film, not that I'm in the film that much, but, the sort of way that I'm in the film, I think they were surprised by. And so it helped them, get more on board with it.
It strikes me, we're in the age of Trump, and everything is political these days. Now, all these films you worked on 4 or 5 years, if not longer. I wondered, are there aspects of the film that came out differently or may have met it with a different reaction from audiences because of the moment we're living in right now?
Sure.
Yeah.
Without a doubt.
Yeah.
It changes the perspective on everything.
Mr. Rogers talks about bullying in your film.
Sure, and building a wall, the land of make-believe, all these things. But for me, the issues that we're dealing with right now in our culture have existed for a long time. I did a film called Best of Enemies about these debates between Gore Vidal and William Buckley, which actually deals with all the same issues of TV as a place to either make conversation and civility better or worse, and also the kind of issue of where are the grown-ups in our culture. They're issues I care about, so I keep coming back to them in different films in different ways. And if that was a cautionary tale, Won't You Be My Neighbor is, a hopeful tale. It was also, we have these conversations as filmmakers about, are we preaching to the converted? Are we just talking to each other? And I felt like it was this rare opportunity to make a film that would play for people who I didn't agree with. And it's done that. And that's the thing that's actually given me the most optimism, is that there are people who I don't agree with politically who have loved the film, and maybe in that way we can have some common ground we can build upon.
I think with the Trump thing, though, it's interesting. I mean, we had a similar experience with Identical Strangers, but things that you'd never planned for. So, suddenly border separations are happening and people saying, oh, isn't it awful, families being separated, which is, a central theme of my film. But I think where the Trump thing is interesting is plays in possibly to the success of documentary this year, which I don't think anyone really predicted. And it's just a sense that the real world is such a crazy, bonkers place at the moment that almost going to fiction feels like it's like what a fiction can't match anything that's happening in the real world, and it seems natural to kind of turn to documentary to kind of make sense of the world. I don't know.
I certainly, had always intended Quincy to be a deep dive into his life, but it started to morph because we did film pre-Trump and then we finished, recently, and because the big culmination of the movie leads up to the Smithsonian African American History Museum. And that was a real celebration. At the time, it was like right before the election, and it felt like, oh wow, we have this museum. We'll finally reckon with the deep, dark, shameful past of this history. And my dad's life really it maps out every single decade of what it's like to be Black in America. And the movie became, because of what's happened in this country, it has become, hopefully, a treatise on race and the fact that we haven't really faced the pain that's been caused by the racial inequalities in this country. But that became way clearer once we knew what kind of world we were releasing the movie into.
Yeah. I mean, it struck me that the opening of the museum, your dad produces the gala that they have, and Obama is there, and it just takes on an added poignancy that it was clearly an emotional night, but in retrospect, it's even more emotional.
Yeah.
I found it so moving.
Thank you.
I mean, it just brought me right back to that moment. But it's interesting because we've been having this debate around Free Solo, this conversation, because here it is, a film that has got nothing to do with politics, so to speak, but why are audiences responding to it in the degree that they did? And I think it's because we give people an opportunity to see someone who actually does something, and that also he's able to connect when you don't think he could connect. Like, ultimately, it's about people working together in some way. And like an inspiring story of courage, like that, we can all have this vision and like work really hard and do something. Thank goodness for documentary films.
Well, I think the metaphor of your film fits really well right now. Like, to a certain extent, we're all just like pushed up against the rock, clinging on by the skin of our fingers with just like a little bit of chalk to keep us from falling off. So
we'll get through. We'll get to the top.
I mean, it's like such an amazing story, but also just as a metaphor for what all of human life is like, but maybe how people feel in a precarious time. Obviously, I kind of feel like RBG is at the pinnacle of films that feel extremely relevant at the time they're released without, obviously, any intention on our part. We started this film in January 2015 and ended up releasing it not only into Donald Trump's America, but also into an era of Me Too and Time's Up and the whole question of women fighting back against discrimination in a way they never had before. By the time you're in your final post-production stages and you're just like watching the film again and again for like stupid little technical reasons, and you think if you watch it one more time, you're gonna kill yourself. There was something about watching it through in those final hours that made it feel really different even to us than the film that we thought we made. Just hearing Ruth Bader Ginsburg's quiet but like super steely, determined little voice fighting, arguing back to, at that time, 9 Supreme Court male justices who were kind of, towering over and at times condescending to her on the question of women's rights under the Constitution. It just felt like it had this whole added layer of emotion that it's like, oh, look at that. Like, we didn't, sometimes the outside world can add a whole new dimension to a story that, we'd been working on and shaping over a period of years.
How much of a role do all of you play in the release of your movies? How responsible do you have to be for the social media around them? Any viral clips that take off?
Depends on your distributor and who's helping you. The good thing was that Fred Rogers is somebody who has a virality to him in social media already, so part of it was just riding that wave, and then in the wake of RBG, it's audiences waking up to the idea that They want to have this kind of experience with other people in a communal space, not just at home. And it seems like a year ago you couldn't pay people to go see documentaries in theaters, you know. And I remember a lot of despair 2 years ago, and there's nobody who would have predicted we would have had this year with documentaries.
Yeah, Sundance was like super quiet this year for acquisitions.
For that very
Everyone
reason.
was like, this is a duff year for.
Right. Yeah, nobody wants to see a
And now
documentary in the
it's like,
theater.
wow.
Right. Yeah. But we can't get too optimistic because it's like, you know,
It'll
then
change.
the storyline is, oh, documentaries are huge, they're big. And then like, you know, next year people spend a bunch of money to acquire them. A few don't do well and it's, oh, documentaries are dead, they're over. You know.
But we can enjoy the moment.
Yeah.
It's an important moment,
Let's
and
enjoy it.
it's amazing. And I feel like what happens with this power of that voice is interesting. And so we'll see.
I'm curious, because these films often take years to make and there's so much footage involved, both how you pace yourselves and how you work through so much footage. I mean, Morgan, your other film this year, They'll Love Me When I'm Dead, about Orson Welles, I mean, you kind of look at all his films, his final movie, The Other Side of the Wind, fresh interviews, just on a day-to-day basis. It must be like, well, excuse me, like climbing a mountain.
Yeah.
How do you do it?
But it's great. I mean, that's the fun part, you know, where every bit of footage you look at is a surprise. It's like the paper chase, where you find these nuggets that make your week or your month, you know, and I've had many of those experiences on both the films. I love that part of it. I mean, the researcher part of me, and it's something people don't talk that much about in documentary filmmaking, but it's, you know, you just feel like there's always that new thing you find that is going to make your film work, and it's not drudgery. In fact, it might be my favorite part of the process is the editing. I mean, that's where documentary films are made. They're written in the edit room.
You're in the right business then.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm interested in Bing's film because, like, having made like observational films before, which personally I find like one of the toughest kind of types of documentary to make. I mean, just like how much footage you must have had. Like, what was your ratio in the end with that? I mean, how many hours?
I never really calculated it. I mean, maybe I had like 200, 250 shoot dates. So.
Wow.
I don't know, is that a lot?
It's a lot.
Yeah,
It's a
that's
lot.
a lot.
I had 800 hours, so I mean,
wow. Yeah.
but that's more. We had 2,000 hours of archival stuff, which was tough to get through. But it was also great because I saw the stuff I'd never seen before. There's stuff that my dad hasn't seen in years that was in the film. So it was like nice to see him respond to this.
I mean, what were the biggest surprises in some moment you discovered that you just thought, wow?
We found some really great footage from like never aired before French documentaries and things like, you know, shows that I'd never seen before of my dad in process, and I thought that was really cool. And also there was a lot of really good, we took audio because we didn't have any talking heads. We wanted it to all be kind of visceral and audio. And we found a lot of stuff like Frank Sinatra talking about my dad, Ray Charles talking about my dad. That kind of stuff I think really made it feel intimate for him as well as the audience.
And I'm curious, in the case of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, you had Supreme Court audio, but of course no video.
Right.
So how much of a challenge did that seem?
You know, the challenge was really just the psychological challenge of saying, like, yes, we're documentary filmmakers, a visual medium, but we're not going to let the fact that there aren't pictures here scare us away from using substantial chunks of this audio, because it's really powerful. You know, just even in some pitch reels that we put together, we just hadn't even covered it. We just, like, you know, you were listening to her voice in those recordings just with a total black screen, and then we would go back to our next interview or next. And, you know, we even said to each other watching, like, wow, even with nothing on it, that is a powerful voice. So let's not shy away from using it. Like, that said, we cared about to us, the coolest find was the home movies of a young Ruth Bader, and then of her husband Marty when they were for her college graduation and they were first together. Like, family members of her from her husband's family had saved them, and her biographers had like tracked them down like 15 years earlier. Justice Ginsburg didn't even know they existed anymore, and so when we showed them to her, she was like, "Where did you get those?" And we're like, "Well, we got them from your husband's family. They were actually sitting around somewhere." But.
And in the case of the young Fred Rogers, I mean, did his family have those kind of?
They had some, but I actually used virtually no pictures, maybe 2 pictures of him as a kid. And I kind of made a conscious decision that I didn't want to front load his childhood into the film. I wanted him his childhood to come out and how he thought about childhood through his show. So we ended up coming up with this idea of animation. And with Daniel Striped Tiger as kind of the surrogate for who Fred was as a child. And that became the way of us investigating chapters of his childhood, but really in terms of how it influenced his thinking about the show he was doing. And that was just a wonderful kind of creative opportunity to try something different.
I mean, documentary sounds very analytical, just the facts. And yet you watch each of these movies, and each one, for very different reasons, provokes this incredible emotional responses. I mean, how conscious are you when you're assembling your film of eliciting an emotional response from the audience?
Well, with Free Solo, we knew that the climb was going to be terrifying. How can we manage that for our audience? And this kind of coincides with our surprise, where we began making this film and Alex was online dating and setting up dates in every stop of his book tour. So our great surprise is when he brought a woman home, Sani. It just really provided this opportunity with the film for us to make it about a connection and kind of modulate how the climb went, where we could really build something, and so it was about climbing, but it was actually about connecting and falling in love. I didn't understand what sort of experience it would be when we made this film. And then watching it with the first audience, we were like, whoa.
For me, like, emotional truth is what we're striving for in documentary. There is this school of thought which is that documentary should be very dispassionate and just the facts kind of thing. But I think you can have that narrative fidelity, but if you don't have a kind of emotional truth to your storytelling, then the audiences aren't going to connect with it. And that's part of what makes it cinematic, is eliciting that emotional response. And I think with the brothers in Three Identical Strangers, you know, I wanted the audience to go through what they went through. I wanted people to experience the highs and the lows, and that's very much why we kept it kind of forced perspective. So people talk about the reveals in the film. There are a lot of twists in Three Identical Strangers, but it's very much just from the perspective of the brothers. You learn information as they learnt it, and so you're very much like on that journey with them, and that was really, really important to me.
I mean, how much for all of you is music? It's not just an afterthought. Yeah. It's kind of really part of the fabric of these movies.
Well, I mean, I'll take that one. You know, I was just thinking when you were speaking, like I feel so lucky because I, you know, had this incredible catalog available to us. None of the music in the movie is not somehow leads back to Quincy. To have somebody who's created music that expressed a certain emotion, and then to be able to pair that with an emotional moment in his life is a real huge blessing. That being said, it spans so many decades, and there's so many different types of genres, and so the music selection became essential to the storytelling, because it can be anything from the Sanford & Son theme song to, you know, Soldiers in the Rain, which is this really emotional piece that he did, and to make sure that the kind of stop and start, like the gears of the movie felt right. It did all kind of end up being predicated on the music selection, for sure.
When you've got like the greatest living composer, you know, arranger, producer of all time, it's kind of like...
There's so much of it, though. There's so much music. There's so much music.
I can't imagine when at the end of the film, when it tells you how many albums he's worked on and shows, it would take the rest of your life to listen to it all.
I know. But it's also great, you know, embarrassment of riches.
I mean, Bing, how did you go about getting a score for your film?
There's a point a period of time where I was like, well, no, this film should work without any music at all. And so I started editing with that mindset. And then in the final year, like, you know, when we were really trying to dial it in, temp music became really important. You know, we knew we were going to be sort of up against the gun, so, you know, having temp music that would really, you know, sort of mimic what we wanted the composer to do would be really important. And there were 2 needle drops that we got. Originally, I wanted the end credit song to be Old Man by Neil Young, but he just outright said no. So we got a song that actually ended up being something that was really close to me growing up, you know, that helped me survive. So.
Which one is that?
It's called This Year by the Mountain Goats.
How much of a challenge is music rights? I mean, I guess your film may be accepted. I don't know what you're doing.
I was going to ask what the music was.
The licensing and the music rights were a huge battle. There's so many people represented in the film, and like huge important people who have their own estates and all that stuff. Yeah. There was a lot of conversations, a lot of negotiating, a lot of begging.
At least you had some connections.
We had this crazy thing. We had this. My editor put this Billy Joel song in the film, where the lyrics of the song like directly reference two characters from the film. We actually thought at one point it was about those characters. It just ends up as a coincidence, even though he was around at the same time. My editor had it in the film, and the commissioners and everyone had put money in were like, "Oh, we love that," and then the record label wanted crazy amounts of money. So we had this great music supervisor who just said, just try writing to him. And I wrote, we didn't even have an email. I wrote sort of like handwritten letter to Billy Joel. Okay. And he came back and he let us have it for like, I don't know, it was like $1,000 or something for All Worldwide Bright. So I'm now the biggest Billy Joel fan.
You just made it so every single documentarian is going to write a letter to Billy Joel. That's so cool.
A couple of you also have original songs at the end of your movies.
Our sort of theme song was Diane Warren wrote it for the film. It actually came in kind of after our Sundance premiere, and Jennifer Hudson agreed to sing it. Fortunately, through our amazing composer, Miriam Cutler, was friends with someone who was a friend of Diane's. It's like, oh, you've got to see this film. Somebody showed her to the film. She said, I have to write this. I have to write the song. She's very super fast, so she wrote it in like 2 weeks. And then I think it took a longer time for Jennifer Hudson to agree to both to agree to sing it and then to have a moment in her insane, transcontinental schedule to sing it.
Another subject that came through in several of your films is that of aging. What did you learn kind of following Fred Rogers or Ruth Ginsburg or Quincy Jones about aging that you might not have realized before?
I mean, the thing is, as a parent, I realized first of all how much I got from Fred Rogers and what he was teaching us about kids. He was actually teaching us how to be parents. That he was always making the show not just for the child watching, but for the parent on the couch in the back of the room and kind of modeling how we should talk to kids and respect children. The natural instinct as a parent is to shield your kids from bad things or to tell them not to pay attention to bad things, and kids are way too smart for that. I'm still learning how to be the best parent I can. I feel like this film taught me so much about how to grow into that role because we're not born with those chops. Mm-hmm.
I'm sure you've had some experience with this too, but watching the pain of him losing friends, every year, every month. When you're in your 80s and you've succeeded at living, the simple fact is that you just lose friends all the time. And so it's this constant mirror of the inevitable. Quincy is he's an anomaly in the sense that he pushes himself to the brink decade after decade, whether it's with health scares or mental health scare, and he keeps bouncing back. His life is absolutely a test of mortality. Everything he does is a test of his mortality and his own limits. And I think having friends die so often is now it's this constant reminder that you can't test mortality that much. You just can't do it because eventually you're not going to win the test. Not to be grim, but I think so much of what he does is about continuing to transcend and push and push and push. And I think he'll do that for the rest of his life.
For a documentary filmmaker, time is a great antagonist, and it always has been. You think of the great docs, things like Hoop Dreams or like the 7 Up series. If you stretch the timeline long enough, anyone's life becomes just the most compelling study of all kinds of things, from the kind of nature-nurture thing that's going on in my film to, the trauma and whether people can get past that's kind of in your film. Time is such an important factor in documentary filmmaking, and in my experience, the longer you can stretch that, and we got 6 decades in our film, but even with Alex, having to climb before the end of this climbing season, and having to make it, or before he gets too old to kind of attempt it, it's kind of a central theme of all the best docs, I feel.
Well, for us, it became like a central idea that you only have a finite amount of time. Mm-hmm. And that was really important to him. And it actually made me think a lot about how much time I have and what I'm doing with my time. And we had, a very good friend of ours die in the middle of Eliciting. And a lot of these guys die doing what they love.
Well, he says so simply in the film, there's this you can die at any time. Yeah. And there's this illusion that that's not the truth. And the fact that he does what he does is just a constant reminder, which is a constant reminder for us.
I mean, yes, it's a really good reminder that we have to relish every single day and like live it with intention.
Yeah,
And
I
Julie.
mean, obviously, aging is a big part of RBG, the film, and the Supreme Court justice, whose lifespan a lot of people in America are quite focused on. I actually think there's some pretty big comparisons between the way that your dad and RBG have dealt with not only being in their 80s, but also dealing with really serious health issues, the health issues that come up in your film, and Justice Ginsburg going through both colon cancer and pancreatic cancer. Both of them kind of have approached their aging with this just like unbelievably kind of kick-ass determination of, just like I never let anything else get me, I'm not letting this get me. I'm going to get up and fight another day. Like, there's a soundbite that I love in our film where Justice Ginsburg says, like, kind of like the good thing about having colon cancer and pancreatic cancer, which you're like, you know, it's amazing to see a positive side to that, is it's really given me such a great appreciation for the joys of being alive. And like, that's like a profoundly wise thing to say. It's sort of like a Mr. Rogers level wisdom, and you can't go wrong with if that's your mindset. Like, that's a pretty good way to look at life.
And interesting, I mean, Morgan, your Orson Welles movie, that's almost the flip side, because you could argue he's squandering his life as he goes through those
Well, it's
final
called
years.
The Love Me When I'm Dead. So in a way, maybe it's about the afterlife. He was so vital at the end of his life, he just didn't get to finish things. You know, I mean, he was somebody who would not accept getting old and thought that he was doing his best work at the end of his life, and the next thing he was going to do was going to be the best film he ever did. And I find this incredibly inspiring. I mean, just spending time seeing what he was willing to do here in his late 60s, pretending he was a film student so he could sneak to shoot his indie film in the back of a car with a blanket over his head. You know, all these, the man that made a Citizen Kane, who was basically willing to do anything it took. But it didn't matter. He had no ego about it. It all was about the film. And I feel like that's something that I get so much inspiration from.
You know, looking back, what was the biggest influence growing up that may have shaped your point of view as a filmmaker?
That's a big question. I mean, I would say, in documentary terms, probably, you know, like Michael Apted's 7 Up. Also, Hoop Dreams, that's a big one. But then just for storytelling in general, Kurosawa and Hitchcock, which, you know, and I think that the lines between documentary and drama are getting increasingly blurred, and I think, you know, documentary is a broad church, so all these influences are increasingly relevant.
Julie, what was?
Yeah, I mean, you know, there's so many docs, I wouldn't know where to start with that. I mean, Hoop Dreams and Roger and Me are the two that come to mind, but I think even more really books. Reading, like seeing how a story gets put together in 1984 is kind of my all-time favorite, just in terms of bringing together big ideas and like a story that you're so deeply ensconced with on every page, and characters who you're caring everything that happens to them. I mean, like, to me, that's the feeling that you're trying to create, whether you're writing a book, making a fiction film, or making a doc.
I mean, I started my career as a journalist, and I was definitely under the sway of new journalism. So my heroes were really, like, Joan Didion was a major hero for me, but people who were talking about nonfiction issues, but with a kind of a fiction way of storytelling and articulation. And that's something that I was trying to do as a young man, and that I'm still doing in documentary, and I think we're all doing.
Bing, what do you look back and see as an influence?
Yeah, I didn't really watch a lot of films when I was growing up. I feel like I read more than I watched films, but there's one film in particular that I saw when I was 15 that was like, oh, I want to tell stories. Is this weird Richard Linklater film called Waking Life, and I've seen that film more than any other film ever. There's something about that really, just the inquisitiveness of it. It's very much about just like trying to find your place in the world. I think that was the start of it all.
Rashida?
I'm just panicking that this question is coming to me. Like, I've just been panicking for the last minute. I don't know. I feel like I've been very lucky. I had so much influence from music to books to films to TV. I watched a lot of TV growing up, and again, I feel like for me, it's the storytelling aspects. If I think of, you know, any film by Mike Nichols was the reason I wanted to become a filmmaker, because it doesn't matter who the people were in his movie. There's pathos and heart and, you know, intelligence in storytelling. And I think recently, the reason I thought it would maybe be a good idea to make Quincy was I saw this movie Still Bill about Bill Withers that I thought was so tender, and it was such a great balance of a personal story and educating people who weren't fans of his, making people who were fans feel good about knowing a little bit more about his life. I just was really moved by that movie.
Influences. You know, that film Stevie was a very important film for me when I watched it. But I also worked for Mike Nichols for a year, and between my first and second films, and it was one of the most important creative experiences I had.
What was he working on at that time?
Closer, which was a very intimate set in London, so we were kind of outside where we'd normally be. Watching that process and seeing how much he believed in the process was very important to me. You know, the drama, the structure, which you don't, I make documentaries, but I think the power of those stories and like how much he would give was very, very influential for me.
Good. What's the first thing you do when you wrap a film?
First thing we do when we wrap a film, I don't know, like go hang out with my kids. When we wrap a film, well, this one was immense relief. I felt immense relief, and I was like, Jimmy, let's just go and hang out with our kids.
Yeah.
I mean, sorry, this sounds really corny, but probably just like a drink. You know, Al and I definitely had a couple beers after we finished. Yes. It's nice release.
Daily.
You go skateboarding.
Not as much as I used to, but I feel like the film isn't wrapped yet. I mean, it just seems like this ongoing thing, and it just keeps going. But like on other projects I worked on, it's just go have a drink or something, with the crew.
Well, there's that experience. A documentary doesn't feel wrapped in the same way it's like on a scripted film. That it feels like it's not really wrapped until you screen it for an audience, and at that moment, it's not your film anymore; it's their film. So that's the experience that I had on this film, and that I think we all have. Is like that's the moment you can celebrate. Till then, you're just holding your breath.
Yeah, I'll go with cooking and eating. I like to cook and bake, and I like to eat it. My husband likes to eat it, but sometimes during the sort of intensity of the final phases of making a film, some of the home-cooked meals fall by the wayside. So I like to jump back in with a good meal.
Yeah, I feel that my documentary is still out there and a living, breathing thing. I mean, just a month or so ago, we got a call from a woman who'd seen the film and said, I was adopted from the same agency as the triplets in this film, and I've just done a DNA test after watching your film, and it's matched with another woman she was from New York, another woman in California, and they got together, and it turned out they were twins that had been separated at birth, at the age of 54, meeting for the first time. So it's still like out there. And
got a sequel.
Still evolving.
Wow.
Well, listen, thank you all very much for joining us here today. Tim Wardle, Julie Cohen, Morgan Neville, Bing Liu, Rashida Jones, and Chai Vasarhelyi. It's been a great conversation. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Hi, I'm Julie Cohen.
I'm Bing Liu.
I'm Tim Wardle.
I'm Rashida Jones.
Thanks for watching.
Thanks for watching.
Thank you for watching The Hollywood Reporter.
The Hollywood Reporter.
The Hollywood Reporter Roundtables on YouTube.
On YouTube.
On YouTube.